So LaVar Arrington,
Yep.
Nick Saban was in the news recently.
It's about that time.
Yeah, well, Jahmyr Gibbs, who's now a member of the Detroit Lions, he complained about how hard practices were at Alabama. But it's kind of interesting because Jahmyr Gibbs' running back coach spoke with the Lions and said that, he's looking for Jahmyr Gibbs to, show physicality in every sense at training camp, which I think kind of feels like an Alabama move, but apparently they want him to do that in Detroit. So, it feels like we've got a little bit of an issue there since Jahmyr Gibbs didn't like how Alabama practiced all those years. So nonetheless, that story was out there. And then Nick Saban decided, well, since everybody's not a big fan of potentially my practice habits and the things I do at Alabama, why don't I go ahead and just serve this one up for him? And so Nick Saban spoke with Joel Klatt of Fox Sports recently about his issue with the College Football Playoff Committee. Let's take a listen.
The problem with the way the whole system is, all we do is take the teams that win the most games at the end of the year and put them in the playoffs. But do you really get the best teams? When they told me that we would be favored against 3 out of the 4 teams that got in the playoffs, I'm like, well, why aren't we in the playoffs? But if you're going to have parity, you have to have a better way of figuring out who has the best teams, not just because you lose 2 games on the last play of the game.
So that was Nick Saban talking about the issue he's got with the voting and the College Football Playoff Committee deciding which teams get into the 4-team playoff. Now, this is going to be all irrelevant coming up here soon because they expand the College Football Playoff, but I understand what he's saying, as opposed to, is it about your resume or is it about who's the best team, the eye test and all that? But at some point, the games on the field have to matter. And look, they lost 2 games. They were close games last year, but I don't know how you would take anybody outside that made it to the college football playoff in the top 4, like a TCU, and say, well, no, Alabama would beat them on a neutral field, so they should go in. They probably would have, but they didn't get it done when it mattered during the course of the season on the field. Thus, that's why Alabama wasn't put into the college football playoff.
I mean, the Penn State won the Big Ten one year and didn't make it into the playoffs. And a team out of the Big Ten made it into the playoffs. Now, to me, that's ridiculous.
Yeah,
I can't support if you've lost 2 games. Like did they play in the SEC championship?
No.
They didn't even make it.
No.
Who played? It
was Georgia and why am I blanking on it? Georgia and. Oh, geez. Why am I blanking on it? But no, Alabama was not part of it. It was.
I mean, so if you're going to be favored against an inferior opponent, like you said, that played their games that were in front of them and won enough to make it in, that actually, in a lot of ways, does have to be your resume. You do have to win to get in a lot of cases, in a lot of instances.
It was my whole thing LSU.
Yeah. Right, okay. I just don't buy the idea that because you're playing a tougher schedule or whatever it may be, I don't buy if you've lost, you should still be able to get in under the circumstances of you've lost more than 1 game to 2 really good opponents. I just don't. If there's a team that hasn't lost, then they've shown that they could win against the teams that they're playing, especially if you're talking about a team that goes through a conference, right? Like whether it's the Big 12, whether it's the Pac-12, whether it's the Big 10, whether it's the SEC, if someone wins more games than another team in that conference, I would assume that they have more of a right to be in the playoffs than one that may have had a loss. That's just my opinion on it. And that might not be a popular opinion, but I know that that's how my world was governed when I was in college. You win, you're in. Keep winning, keep winning. Now, people got left out. Like, what if you had more than, 1 team? Like the year that Penn State should have been national champs, but Nebraska got it. Both teams were undefeated. but you didn't have a playoff then, so it didn't really matter. But now the fact that you do have a playoff, I've always said take the winner of each conference. How many conferences are there?
Well, there's, the Power Five.
How many power? So it's 5.
Yeah.
So when you think about 5, all right, you got 5 participants. How many games are in the playoffs right now? There's 2 rounds, right?
Yeah. There's the college football playoff is 4.
So it's four teams, 1 championship game, and that's going to expand. But if I'm where we're at right now, and it's 4 teams. I just think that you got to measure out the strength of the conference, and if you've won that conference, like, because to me, I feel like it's if a school like Kansas State goes undefeated and they win their conference, it's hard to say they shouldn't be in there to someone who's a runner-up or didn't even participate in the conference championship game, like, or even to say the runner-up should be in, and someone that won their conference and went undefeated shouldn't be in. I don't buy that. I don't subscribe to that, and I don't know how to make sense of that any other way.
I like when Alabama gets in when there's an argument against them, because it pisses people off. That I find comedy in that. And
because they can win.
Yes.
You know they can win it.
Of course. And I would also argue Alabama could have won this year. I mean, them against Georgia would have been a better matchup than TCU Georgia turned out to be. Like, I would totally agree. And I like that Nick Saban is pointing to the gambling lines and the betting lines as his argument for why Alabama should have been in the college football playoff. But in every sport, the way it works is there are tiebreakers. When there's a tie or there's something of equal value happening, you go down the list of tiebreakers. Okay, what was their head-to-head record? What was their interconference record? Division? Like, all of that stuff. And so it still goes back to the original tiebreaker, which is the win-loss record. And I would agree, Alabama's 2 losses last year were really close games. They lost that epic game against Tennessee, and there was a field goal that won it for Tennessee there. That was an amazing game. And then they lost that game in overtime on a 2-point conversion to LSU. Those are really close games.
That's the beauty of college football. I hate to say it.
And you still lost. Like, I would agree that, like, look, there was 4 points was the difference between Alabama being in the college football playoff. But those 4 points have to matter at some point.
They have to matter.
And
they have to matter.
Yeah, I agree. That's why I think, look, it would be, once the college football playoff expands next year, this is, I'm sure people will find the argument for the 13th team and then the 17th team and then whatever the expansion turns into down the road. But when it comes to Nick Saban and Alabama, it just, I would say, listen, man, maybe you would have beat Michigan last year. I don't know, but they probably would have had a really good shot at beating Michigan.
You could make that argument point every single year. My again, it's a different era, but we had the best team in the world my last 2 years of school. My sophomore and junior year of college, we had probably the deepest talented team in all of the world, Craig. And we ain't win S because we always let a game get away. My sophomore year, it was Michigan. My junior year, my last year there, it was Minnesota. Like, we always let games get away from us at the end of the year for one reason or another. No excuses, just we did not win those games, and we would slip. Like my sophomore year, I think we lost, 2 games or something to that effect. My junior year, we lost 3 games in a row. And I know we lost those games because you lost the drive to fight to try to win because you weren't going to play for a national title anymore. So, it's not always about, on paper, the best team. And that, to me, that's the beauty of the game. It's really about, can you win week in and week out, can you deliver the goods? And sure, you can take one setback. In the college playoff era, you can take one setback. But don't be complaining if you took two. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
There's a team out there that probably only has one loss that should have had just as much a right to be able to be in that playoff to try to see if they could match and test what their one-loss record is against some other teams that haven't undefeated or one-loss teams. They should get to test themselves over a two-loss team. They just should. I'm sorry. The more losses you have, the less of a conversation it is, if you ask me.
And also, like, to your point on, the best team maybe sometimes doesn't always win. Like, I would argue Michigan was a better team than TCU last year. I could make that argument until they played, and I can't make that argument anymore. Like, and I would say, listen, Michigan would have been a better matchup against Georgia because I think they absolutely would have been. But they didn't get the job done on the path there, so they didn't get the opportunity to do it. Like, that's just the way this stuff goes. And we can go back and do hindsight 2020 and say, well, if Michigan would have gotten in or if Alabama would have gotten in, that national championship game would have been much better. I think people forget. They look at how bad the national championship game was between Georgia and TCU, and they forget the quality of football we got in the semifinal games. That was the best semifinal lineup that we've ever seen. You were there for Ohio State, Georgia.
I was.
Michigan, TCU was banana land. And that we got to see that and Ohio State and Georgia right after that game. Like, those games were fantastic, and you could argue for Michigan, or either one of those results. You could have argued Ohio State should have won that game if Marvin Harrison doesn't get injured. Marvin Harrison Jr. doesn't get injured.
They probably win that game if he doesn't get injured. And they didn't have an answer for him.
Like, we were this close to seeing Ohio State and Michigan in the national championship, but it didn't happen. Like,
that would have been amazing for
awesome.
the 10.
Awesome.